The last module for the cardiovascular system is about regulating blood pressure and capillary exchange. The objectives of this module are to describe the regulation of blood pressure, relate capillary structure and function regarding nutrient exchange, describe how the cardiovascular system reacts to exercise, and briefly describe shock and other selected cardiovascular diseases and terms. We measure blood pressure on patients as a way of measuring cardiac output. Without enough output or blood pressure, tissues don't get adequate blood and therefore not adequate oxygen, nutrients, or have the ability to get rid of waste. This can be a problem in the tissues and cause them to die. The next several slides will discuss how our bodies will try to maintain blood pressure. Systolic pressure is when the ventricles contract. This is the top number in the blood pressure reading. And when they relax, this is diastolic pressure, the lower number in the blood pressure reading, or the bottom number. Homeostatic blood pressure is supposed to be 120/80. The contraction and relaxation of the arteries as the ventricles alternately contract and relax can be felt as your pulse. So again, the pulse is the difference that you feel between systolic and diastolic pressure. It's not the two numbers subtracted. We usually use the radial artery to sense a pulse, but other places will also work. As you move further from the heart, the pressure decreases. However, pressure needs to be high enough so that nutrient exchange can occur at the capillary level, but not so high that waste cannot be returned from the blood into the tissues. If blood pressure is not regulated, tissues won't be able to stay alive. They need nutrients. They need to get rid of waste. Hopefully you already know this. A certain amount of pressure is required for this to happen, and lots of things can mess with this. Your body will do everything it can to maintain homeostatic blood pressure because it's so important to life. Think about the things that can cause blood pressure to change. You can probably name some already, but that is what we'll be going over in the next several slides. The four main regulators of blood pressure are peripheral resistance. This is how big the blood vessels are, the diameter. The more constricted they are, the more resistance there is, and therefore it would be harder to push blood through a smaller tube. Number two, viscosity, which is essentially the thickness or density of the blood. It's harder to push molasses than it is to push water. Cardiac output, which is basically your heart rate and to a lesser extent stroke volume. If you increase either one of these, you're going to increase blood pressure. And blood volume. How much blood is there? More blood, it's more work for the heart to pump around. So we're going to go over each one of these four, starting with peripheral resistance. Peripheral resistance can be thought of as friction. If the hose is smaller, the pump must work harder to push the fluid through. So if the arteries are constricted or smaller in diameter, then resistance to blood flow increases, which increases pressure. On the other hand, when you dilate the blood vessel or make it bigger, there's less resistance and the blood pressure will drop. So anything that increases vasoconstriction will increase blood pressure. Smoking, for example, can cause vasoconstriction of the peripheral arteries, and that will increase blood pressure. Viagra, or nitric oxide, laughing gas, these are vasodilators. Nitroglycerin pills, people take those. Increase the diameter by relaxing the walls of the blood vessels, and that will decrease blood pressure. Next is blood viscosity, and this is basically the ease at which molecules will flow over each other. For example, molasses is more viscous than oil, which is more viscous than water. So viscosity of blood depends a lot on the amount of blood cells. More blood cells, platelets, that type of thing are going to make it more viscous, but also on your diet. If you increase anything that causes an increase in viscosity, you're going to increase blood pressure because it's going to be harder for that fluid to move. Increasing your serum triglycerides increases viscosity because now you're pushing around grease instead of water. Anemia, on the other hand, because of the lower count of red blood cells, you have fewer cells in there, it's going to decrease viscosity and therefore decrease blood pressure. Third is heart rate and to some extent stroke volume. If either one of these go up, blood pressure goes up. If either one of these goes down, blood pressure goes down. So the faster your heartbeat, the more pressure you have, or the more your heart pumps out each time, the more pressure you have. The most common increase of heart rate is the sympathetic nervous system. Stress, injury, fear, having a fever, all of these increase the sympathetic nervous system stimulation, which increases heart rate, which increases pressure. Depression, sleeping, resting, these types of things activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which of course is going to lower heart rate and therefore lower blood pressure. Last is blood volume. This is where the cardiovascular system ties in with the urinary system. We have about 5 liters of blood on average, but if we drink a lot of fluid and haven't yet filtered that out, that increases blood volume, that increases blood pressure. If we lose fluid, hemorrhaging, dehydration, diarrhea, vomiting, that type of thing will lower blood volume, and that will lower blood pressure. So one of the ways we can increase blood pressure in a person who comes in because of dehydration is to give them IV fluids, which of course is what we do. So there's many things that will change blood pressure, and this list is just huge about all the different things that affect how we maintain homeostasis. Parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system, the medulla oblongata will also, the brainstem will play a role in heart rate. Temperature, a fever increases it, being cold decreases it. Exercise will increase heart rate, which increases blood pressure slightly, although this is offset by the vasodilation. Some hormones increase pressure, some decrease pressure. Your genetics can play a role. The environment, what stressors are out there, a change in blood volume, a change in stroke volume, which is tied to blood volume, vasodilation and constriction of blood vessels, levels of some chemicals, a variety of drugs, legal or otherwise, can change blood pressure. So there's lots of things that can influence blood pressure. And of course, if something causes it to go down, your body is going to try to figure out how to get it to go back up to maintain homeostasis. So when we have a local tissue, or like a part of your body that blood flow has decreased, your body's going to try to fix that or vasodilate just the vessels in that area. On the other hand, when overall blood pressure changes, whether it goes down or up, the body's going to try to fix it by going the opposite way. The two main systems that will help regulate the cardiovascular system's blood pressure regulation is the nervous system and the endocrine system. Certainly there's other systems that will change, but the big two right away are going to be your nervous system through the sympathetic or parasympathetic system, or hormones, the endocrine system. And then of course there's going to be some reactions, particularly by the urinary system, especially if blood volume is involved. But right away, the nervous system and endocrine system are going to help that cardiovascular system maintain 120/80. Some of the things that the nervous system has always checking on you are baroreceptors. Baroreceptors check pressure, like a barometer does, and they are in your carotid and aortic, carotid artery and your aorta, and when they detect that pressure has gone up, the sympathetic nervous systems will be suppressed and the parasympathetic will turn on to try to lower blood pressure. If they detect that pressure is low, the sympathetic will zap the heart to speed it up, and parasympathetic signals will be suppressed. The endocrine system, epinephrine, again the sympathetic nervous system also works through norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter, but epinephrine, the hormone, will also increase heart rate. ADH will be released, and ADH makes you save water. It also constricts some of the vessels to increase peripheral resistance. Both of these will make your blood pressure go up. Now, if your blood pressure has gone up and the endocrine system is involved, it's going to suppress the release of ADH, so you actually pee more. A&P is atrial natriuretic peptide. Atrial natriuretic peptide is released from the heart, and it goes through several steps, but essentially A&P makes you pee. If you can remember that, you'll be okay. Renin eventually will cause the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone saves sodium, which saves water. So renin eventually makes you save water. EPO, or erythropoietin, is going to increase red blood cell synthesis, and that helps. That would be a response if you lost blood, for example. And then aldosterone itself, of course, through renin, increases blood volume. So all of these things, the endocrine system and the nervous system, are going to respond to a change in blood pressure to try to maintain the 120/80. So let's say you got stabbed. Okay, what's going to happen? The first thing is it's going to hurt, but you're going to lose fluid. When you lose fluid, blood volume goes down, so blood pressure goes down. So what will your body do to try to get your blood pressure back up? And you have to remember the 4 regulators of blood pressure: viscosity, blood volume, heart rate, and peripheral resistance. The one that's affected here is blood volume, so you can't pick that one as a fixer because that's the problem. Viscosity is never something that responds. It can be a problem, it can be the cause of a change of blood pressure, but it's never a response. So you're left with what happens to heart rate and peripheral resistance. Well, if blood pressure has gone down because you're stabbed, heart rate must go up and peripheral resistance goes up. So in other words, you got vasoconstriction that's probably going to go on. The nervous system is going to release epinephrine to increase that heart rate, and the endocrine system will release epinephrine, but the nervous system will work through epinephrine, norepinephrine, the sympathetic system, to increase heart rate. Also, ADH and aldosterone will probably be released to help you save water. Okay, remember, all the action of a nutrient exchange occurs at the capillary level, and if blood pressure isn't maintained, then at the capillary level the tissues aren't going to get the stuff they need or be able to get rid of the waste that they have that they're generating. So everything happens at the capillary levels to keep the tissue alive, but overall blood pressure influences what happens at the capillary level. So if you look at this picture, here's a capillary and the blood is going from your left to your right here, and as it comes in it's full of oxygen and nutrients, and you can see the water, amino acids, oxygen, and glucose are all being pushed out. And at the venule end, the waste molecules and some of the water is going to be returned, and this is how it normally should work. Notice the blood cells and the plasma proteins always stay in the capillaries. They should never move out. Okay, so only at the capillary levels can molecules move in and out of the blood. They're not going to move across the walls of the venules, the arteries, the vena cava, or the aorta, because the thickness of the wall is just too thick. There's too much stuff there. When you get down to the capillary levels, it's only the endothelial cells that are left. So it's one cell laid between the plasma and the tissues. All but the large plasma proteins, albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen, can usually get from the blood into the interstitial fluid and vice versa. How they move is different. Small particles like gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and lipid-soluble things can move by diffusion. But charged molecules or larger molecules must go through pores or be transported across the membrane of the endothelial cells. Moving blood due to blood pressure tends to push things through the membranes as well because you have pressure, hydrostatic pressure or blood pressure. Pushing back or the opposite forces are mostly osmotic pressure. Remember that the salt sucks in osmosis, so where there's more dissolved substances, that's where the water wants to go. As you push out substances, the water gets pushed out as well. So the blood pressure is really the big force here because osmotic pressure should be fairly balanced across both. So in this picture here you have the arterial end of the capillary and the venule end of the capillary at the right side of the slide, and the molecules are diffusible, so these molecules are probably gases. And remember, by the rules of diffusion, things will move from high to low concentration. So the green molecule, because there's more in the blood than there is in the space, is going to move into the space, and the blue molecule will move back into the blood, based on the rules of diffusion. When it comes to osmotic pressure, the amount of dissolved substances in the plasma and in the interstitial space should be about equal most of the time. So if you're in a healthy homeostatic state, water is going to move equally across the membrane in both directions because the amount of stuff in the blood and the stuff in the interstitial space is equal. Blood pressure, however, is much higher at the arterial end than it is at the venual end, because this end, the arterial end, is closer to the heart. And while you don't have to remember the numbers here, notice that the 35 is higher than the 25 at the arterial end, and 25 osmotic pressure is higher than the 18 left of blood pressure at the venual end. This means things tend to move out of the capillary at the arterial end and move into the capillary at the venual end, which makes sense. Nutrients will be pushed out here, and waste can be pushed back into the capillary here at the venual end. So the net movement is in at the arterial end and out at the venual end. So into the tissues at the arterial end and out of the tissues at the venual end. Alright, the last thing we're going to talk about is a few different circumstances that can change blood pressure. First of all, exercise. When you first start to walk around or move beyond just sitting at your lazy boy or on your couch, vessels in your legs will vasodilate to allow more blood flow to your legs, say, if you're walking. And your heart rate will increase. This increases blood flow to your exercising muscles, they get more oxygen, they get more glucose, and everybody's happy. And so you're going to generate more carbon dioxide because of that exercise, and of course that's going to increase your breathing rate to get rid of that extra waste. It'll also bring more oxygen in, so it kind of all balances out. And because vasodilation has occurred, which lowers blood pressure, the increase in heart rate, which increases blood pressure, kind of offset each other. So you have more cardiac output, but you don't have a huge increase in blood pressure, maybe just slightly. Well, let's say you move from walking to running. Okay, you're going to exercise a little more. So you have an increase in heart rate even more, and maybe more vasodilation. And at this time, you probably are also sweating, which is going to start to lose water. The lower volume is going to decrease blood pressure, but your increased heart rate is increasing blood pressure. Blood flow now has been shunted to your arms and legs or your exercising muscle, and there's less to kidneys, digestion. So there's less kidney filtration, there's less digestion going on because you're busy running. And as long as the contracting muscles can get enough oxygen, you can continue this. However, at some point you're not going to be able to keep going because you're going to be too dehydrated, which will drop blood pressure, which will reduce blood flow to those muscles, which will reduce oxygen to them, and when they run out of oxygen, they're not going to be able to keep contracting. So you can do this for a little while, but you can't do it forever because you're not going to be able to maintain adequate blood pressure. This is why heat loss or heat stroke, when you're outside and you're exercising vigorously when it's very hot and humid, you got to be really careful because sweating will reduce blood pressure to the point where you aren't going to be able to continue to exercise. But if you continue to try to exercise, now you can't cool yourself anymore because you're going to stop sweating to try to maintain that blood pressure at some point. The most common causes of shock is when you hemorrhage or lose a lot of blood, or have a heart attack when there's major damage to a tissue, to that tissue, so other tissues start to run out of oxygen. And shock is initiated by an acute drop in blood pressure. So when inadequate peripheral blood flow occurs, tissues are going to be starved of oxygen and nutrients, and the cells are going to start to die within minutes. Circulatory shock occurs when 35% of your blood is lost or more, and progressive shock is characterized by that tissue damage, and unless there's medical intervention at this point, it's usually fatal. And while I don't care if you remember everything on this flow chart, lack of oxygen in tissues initiates a lot of these problems. Cell anoxia, they start to run out of oxygen. Okay? And that induces the clotting process, and when you clot, blood flow slows down because you're moving around chunky blood. That further increases or decreases oxygen to those tissues. So now you're kind of in a bad loop. Lack of oxygen to the heart tissue causes myocardial damage, which slows the heart rate, which is aggravating the problem of low blood flow. Low blood pressure to the brain will actually decrease sympathetic nervous system activation, so now you don't get the epinephrine release to make your heart beat faster or change vessel diameter. Vasodilation doesn't happen. So now you have another bad loop, and you can see all these things start to fail. Organs fail. You know, you're not getting any fluid, you're not getting any blood, you're not getting any nutrients to them. Okay, so you got to be really careful when people start to go into shock. Get them fluids, get them oxygen, get them medical help. Okay, a couple definitions before we finish up this slideshow. A myocardial infarction is a heart attack or when heart tissue dies. Angina pectoris is the pain associated with depriving a heart muscle of oxygen. And of course, heart muscle cells do not regenerate. If you don't give them oxygen, they're going to die. Phlebitis is inflammation of the veins. Bradycardia is a slow heart rate. Tachycardia is a fast or irregular heartbeat. Asystole means their ventricles are not contracting. In other words, there's no contraction of the heart, it's not beating. And hypertension is a fancy word for having high blood pressure. Hopefully this last module of the cardiovascular system has taught you lots of good things about blood pressure and how to regulate it. Most important thing in this particular slideshow is the 4 regulators of blood pressure, and if one goes down, one of the other 3 is going to go up to try to maintain homeostasis of 120/80. Please come to class during this lecture. We'll do lots of examples in class. Your online lesson may also help. You can also Google some of this stuff. And of course, don't forget you can ask me questions.